Hello, and welcome to the Our Office webinar series and the session today on strategies for leadership, diversity, recruiting, and retention. Our conversation will be relevant for anyone who's involved in HR, recruitment, or DEI in their organizations, as well as hiring managers and business leaders who need help with shifting their thinking and processes around talent acquisition and retention of employees. We have the next slide, please. I'm Anushka Sarif, Head of Partnerships at Our Office, where we help organizations of all kinds build an inclusive workplace by providing the 3 Ps, the professional, the process, and the technology platform at an affordable monthly subscription. I'm so pleased to be joined by Christy Stepp, who's a seasoned HR executive and is a partner at Sigrid Solutions, a management search organization who connects companies to leadership talent. So welcome, Christy.
Thank you.
We also have Sonia, who'll be moderating the questions in real time and chiming in as needed. So thanks in advance, Sonia. So next slide, please. So before we get started, let's first make sure you're familiar with what you see on the slides and with the webinar tool. So this will be an interactive webinar. There'll be polls throughout the session to get your feedback. And you can also use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions or voice your inputs. We'll answer as many questions as possible in real time and later as well in the Q&A. And lastly, please note the session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our events page. We have the next slide. So you'll see the agenda on the slide here. And this will be more of a fireside chat between Christy and I rather than working through a lot of slides. And we'll start by talking about the business case for diversity in leadership. Then we'll look at various considerations for the leadership talent strategy, whilst also talking about proven processes that Christy uses for sourcing and recruiting diverse talent. Finally, we'll talk about how to retain new leaders who may be underrepresented and ensure they are successful, which is so key in building an inclusive culture. As already mentioned, we want this to be an interactive webinar where we can have a two-way conversation through the chat and the polls. So let's start with the first poll to learn more about you in the audience. So if we can have poll number 1 put up, please. So poll number 1 is, let's wait for it to come up. It's how diverse is the current leadership team of your organization? That's middle managers to executive leadership. And let's see here. We have 50% somewhat diverse, which is pretty good. Oh, it's changing. So, okay, so currently we have about a third each of somewhat diverse and not diverse, but we're planning to improve it. So the majority here is somewhat diverse, which I think is quite encouraging, right, Christy?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's actually better than I thought it would be in terms of even 31% saying not diverse, but we're planning to improve it. So that's great.
Yeah, and I would just say, especially for those individuals, it's really great that they're here today when you're looking to improve, because we will be talking about many, many strategies to help you think about that, even for those who are somewhat diverse and those who are very diverse and want to stay there. The market is very dynamic right now.
Exactly. Great. Okay, well, let's move on. So firstly, let's talk about the business case for diversity in leadership. So we know that about 50% of the workforce are currently millennials and Gen Zers, and that will increase to about 75% over time. And a recent Deloitte survey found that those groups of employees are likely to stay for more than 5 years at an organization that has diverse employees and leaders. Also, candidates have an increasing expectation that DEI is a priority in organizations they're looking to join. And one of those factors is how diverse the leadership team is. So Christy, first question for you. In your experience, why do you think this is such an important consideration for organizations?
I think more than any time right now, diversity is absolutely important. Diversity and inclusion. Most people in organizations already know and have heard position statements from organizations. They want to reflect the community as a whole. They want the organizational leadership to reflect their customer and communities. And we've all seen the research. Employees who are earlier in their career will be more invested when they see an organization's commitment to diversity. I will just tell you from personal experience, I know when I've worked in diverse environments, it didn't just help me individually, it helped the entire organization because of the richness of thought, the difference in approaches to products and problem solving. So I'm totally in support of that. And I believe it becomes more and more important, especially as the market has changed. And we all know the market has changed significantly in the past year. And many organizations are looking at this as an opportunity to get their unfair share of talent. So while some organizations, some industries are challenged, there are others who are coming to Cigarette Solutions and saying, we have an opening, find us the absolute best people, and we want the most diverse candidate pool that you can find. And we are finding people who might not have considered looking last year, who are looking now. So I think there's another thing I want to make sure that I mention, and that has to do with the business case for diversity and how you share that inside the organization and publicly. We can remember last year, there were quite a few organizations putting out statements around their opinion about diversity and social justice. And some of them experienced some backlash because they had current and former employees saying, what you are presenting is not the reality of what we're living. I also think that there are some who might not have had that backlash, yet when you put something out in social media, it's forever. So 2 to 3 years from now, someone may pull that up and say, you made this commitment, where are you? So the opportunity really is to make sure there is authenticity and that there is a journey, because it is a journey, and that you don't try to boil the ocean. It's important to say, we're going to build our strategy over time, and here's where we're going to start. And I would say the most important place to start is inside your company. You want to make sure when you step out and you're starting to talk about the diversity, the inclusion, the experience, the culture of your company, that what people inside have to say is the same, because there's platforms like Glassdoor that people check all the time. And with LinkedIn, they can easily find someone who's a second or third contact and ask, what is it really like to work there? So you want to make sure that what you're presenting is consistent. The other thing you can do is cause disengagement with your employees when they feel that you are presenting something that is not authentic to what they're experiencing, and put them at risk for losing them. So someone who might have been fully engaged a year ago may not feel fully engaged now because they don't feel that they work at a company that is truly committed in the way that they have said they are through their actions and their behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned your personal experience there. I always like to understand personal motivation for career paths people choose. So why is this important to you? What in your background or personal experience led you to pursue the field of recruitment with a focus especially on diversity?
So it's interesting. I started my career in human resources in the early 1990s. And almost every job that I've had throughout my career has had some aspect of recruiting, onboarding, retention included, and almost every single job that I've had has had some aspect of diversity. Although what we looked at and considered as being diversity in the early 90s is quite different than the way we represent it now. A lot has changed. A lot of approaches have changed, but I think the essence is still the same for me individually and as I look at others. I know how I felt in organizations where I knew that there was inclusion. I know how it feels to have a vision of where you want to be and to work towards progress with other people who know that you're in a flawed organization with flawed people, yet the goal is to move to a better place. Being able to hit milestones, to see the things that you only talked about actually happen. It's very, very rewarding. From a professional standpoint, I've been the director of diversity at 2 multinational organizations. And I will tell you, my commitment to recruiting is because I saw the most positive results from the recruitment strategy on the overall performance of the company and of those D&I strategies and goals that we set. So looking at how we brought people into the organization, but also how did we make sure that our pools were diverse inside the organization, and were people moving and getting the development that they needed to be successful? Were we setting people up for success to move, to make sure that those opportunities were there for everyone?
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting that you talked about success and metrics, and I think that's key in being able to measure the benefit of a diverse leadership and a diverse organization.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and at the leadership. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say. On the other hand, I also know what it feels like to be the only woman, the only African American, or kind of held up as the first. Mm-hmm. That is a very interesting place to be. So I think where sometimes that sense of isolation can really be difficult, I would say it strengthened my resolve to make sure that I was creating opportunities for other people, making sure that I was speaking about the experience that I had and being able to speak from a place of courage and strength, because I knew people wanted me to be successful. So I was able to have my voice and take chances that allowed me to set up things that led to success for individuals and for the company.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I feel like some of my early roles, I felt like being a little bit different. I felt like I needed to fit in, and I probably stifled my voice to some extent in talking about in the 90s, just so that it's interesting because it's only in the last sort of 5 or 6 years I think that I feel comfortable sort of to be who I am and talk about who I am in a work environment. So
I'll share with you what I would say was a turning point for me, which I didn't expect it to be, but it was shocking. I lived in Singapore for 3 years. I was an expat, and I traveled throughout the Asia Pacific region. And what that experience did for me was really help me to deal with my own biases and my own diversity baggage, because we all have it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think when you move to a new country is you are not going to be able to change that culture. You have to adjust to it. So your attitude about things change, and you can't really bring your experiences to that new environment. So if someone asked me, why do you do X, Y, and Z? I didn't relate it to anything other than actual true curiosity, which when I came back after 3 years, I came back with that. So assuming good first, assuming true curiosity first, being able to develop relationships in a totally different way, and having a different mindset, which I think has helped me to be able to really drive diversity strategy. That experience was life-changing, and not in the way I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be great for my career. It changed me as a person, both personally and professionally.
Wow. Okay, well, let's get back to talent acquisition strategy. So at the leadership level, what should HR leaders or recruiters be thinking about when it comes to talent acquisition strategy?
The most important thing that can be considered, I like to call them the 3 Ps: pipeline, pool, and progression. So it makes it really easy. So when I talk about pipeline, I'm talking about your internal candidates who have the ability to fill leadership roles in the future, and really thinking about the diversity and development opportunities for individual contributors. So we're people who have the desire to move into different roles. And how are you thinking about what they have today Where's the gap between what they have and what they need to be successful, and how are you looking to close that internally? And also thinking about your pipeline when you were looking at external candidates. It needs to be diverse. And I actually worked at a company where that diversity did not exist inside. So one of the things that we did for certain roles is we said we are going to interview internal people, and we're also going to include people of color, women, and people of other diverse backgrounds into our pool as we interview. And one of the things that we found is that sometimes the candidates weren't successful for that particular role, but they were on the radar, and we ended up bringing them in for other reasons. We even expanded that to what we called informational interviews. So if I met someone and I knew there was not an opening at the time, we would bring them in and let them meet people and talk to them and let them know clearly, we don't have a job right now, but we think that you would be a great addition to our organization. So come in, meet us, talk to us. And those worked out well. And interestingly enough, people inside the company said, I want to how do I get an informational interview? And we started to do that internally too. We started having people move from one department to another. And one of the things that I think is really interesting with informational interviews inside the organization is that it's less risky when you're already known to move somewhere else. And if you feel like the organization really wants you to be successful, you can be lifted and move over and develop great skills, even if you decide you don't want to stay somewhere else longer term. You develop more relationships, and it allows people to be successful because they've gotten some breadth before they move up and need more of that specific depth to be successful.
So what about those companies that are aspiring to have that culture, that new culture with more diverse leadership, but their current culture is just not ready for it? How would you go about helping those companies?
I would go back to what I shared earlier around you don't have to boil the ocean. Mm-hmm. So set long-term strategies and work towards them and share them with your key audiences so they know what it is that you're trying to do. A lot of times, not just employees, but all types of groups that are interested in your company will allow you to move towards your aspirational goals and support you in them, knowing you're not where you want to be, but you're working towards it. So you should talk about that, but also understand that there's going to be subcultures inside your organization. So if I hire someone for finance, what they may come in and experience might be totally different than if they come into the marketing department. So there are going to be subcultures within organizations. Typically, that culture that people experience is the one they work in every day. And let's talk about COVID. With the pandemic that we're in right now, there are many people who don't really know what kind of culture they're in, because what existed when they had to go to the office every day for many people has changed significantly, even if they have started to go back in. Everybody may not be in at the same time. There may be more reliance on videos. You don't have that laid back interaction. And sometimes I can think of times when I've just walked by and saw someone and their expression just didn't look right. And it was that conversation in the moment that helped to create that culture of inclusion, that feeling of belonging, the support that someone needed on a bad day, to know that that is not 100% of their experience, that it was a blip, and not have that overshadow their experiences. So for many of our clients, and I think for many companies overall, being very intentional, particularly in how you communicate, and over communicating becomes really, really important when you're thinking about where you want to be, because you don't want to lose your momentum because things have shifted. Once again, we talked about this earlier, you want to make sure that you have metrics. So don't just say, we are going to be a more diverse organization with inclusion. All those words sound great, but what does success look like? And allow yourself flexibility, because we all set great goals and then we have to pivot. So being able to say our goal was this. We came into a year in a pandemic. Our goal is adjusted, but we have not lost sight on where we want to be longer term. Making sure you're continuously communicating that becomes important, because we all know we are forgiving and really tolerant of missteps when we know what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's do another poll to find out more about the organizations represented in our audience and their talent acquisition strategies. So let's put up poll number 2. And poll number 2 is, how important is hiring females, people of color, or people from other underrepresented groups into leadership roles for your organization? So if you want to participate in the poll and let us know. Right now we have 50-50 for extremely important and somewhat important, which is great. Actually, more extremely important right now. Let's just give it another 10 or 20 seconds. This is very encouraging that nobody has hit, well, somebody said that it's not important in their organization. So, but generally, I think the majority is extremely important and somewhat important.
I think it's interesting because having it be important is one thing. Having a strategy on how you're going to do it is something else. And I think oftentimes organizations struggle in going from that vision to actually driving some of those pieces.
Right. Exactly. Okay, well, let's move on now. Let's end that poll. And now we're going to think about the recruitment process end to end. So when it comes to sourcing candidates, we immediately think of sites like LinkedIn, Career Builder, those kinds of sites as good sources. But Christy, how do you go about finding a more diverse pool of candidates?
The most interesting thing for me, and I think it's surprising a lot of times, not everybody has a LinkedIn profile. There are people who have LinkedIn profiles and have not looked at them. So there are people who are active, and I would say that there are people who are not engaged at all. And then there are many people who are inactive. So if I only relied on LinkedIn, I would be in really bad shape. So I have to think about what other networks and organizations exist where I can find people and to reach out and to leverage my network in that way. There's a lot of professional organizations that have their roots in colleges and have continued on. So one of the great sources that I've had over my career, particularly when I've worked in manufacturing and automotive organizations, has been the National Society of Black Engineers. So they're known as NSBE. And what's interesting is when people join NSBE as undergrads, they tend to stay engaged in that organization in graduate chapters. So if they move from state to state, they'll join a new chapter. They're very active in STEM, they're volunteering, and many of them have been at companies for a very long time and may not necessarily have an active LinkedIn site. But I can reach out to them and say, I'm looking for a software engineer with this type of experience. And I've had great sources of referrals from entry level all the way to executives. The other thing, there's like another organization called the Project Management Institute, where people might not necessarily join undergrad, but they're very, very active. So sometimes when I'm looking for professionals, I'll find out, especially if we're doing more of a local recruiting versus a casting the net nationwide or internationally, I'll look to see what types of organizations are active and reach out to see if I can come to speak at an event and meet people that way. because there's always an opportunity. I spoke at a PMI chapter recently. It was very diverse. And what was interesting is it had a very high level of people who had moved to the United States from different countries. So in addition to some of the traditional diversity areas that we think about, there were many other aspects that were really of value. So I always think about those aspects as we look out. And I think companies can do the same thing. Think about who's in your network. There might be nonprofits that are available who have people who volunteer, and it might be a great source of being able to find hidden talent.
Okay, so if you've sourced your candidates, let's talk about creating the candidate slate and the interview process. So what steps would you recommend to reduce bias in these phases of the process?
The most important thing I think any organization can do is train. So and you don't have to create your training from scratch, because there is a lot of training on bias, specifically for interviewers out there. So you can buy something off the shelf, you can bring an expert in, but it's not difficult to be able to establish that for your organization and make sure that it is available. We're all biased, every single one of us. And there are good aspects of bias because it's how our brain works. It helps us to be successful. But when we can understand the impact of our biases when we are interviewing, we can be more aware of them and do better. The next thing I would say is having a panel. Don't rely on one person to interview. And these are low cost examples. You can put together a interview guide with some very consistent questions and use it. So of course, you want to make sure you're seeking legal advice as you put that together. But once you have the opportunity to get something that's established, you can use it over and over again. Interview for competencies. When you're screening resumes, you can remove the names. Those are very easy, low-cost ways of being able to reduce bias. Now there's medium to higher cost ways too. There's many video interview platforms that allow people to answer questions for your first screening in a video format. And some of those organizations even blur the face of that individual and change their voice so that it is neutral. We'll see how that goes as we move forward. I will tell you, I've used it inside of an organization, and the feedback from candidates, they didn't love it. And some hiring interviewers did not love it. Yet there are lots of platforms and things that we did not love when they were introduced that we have become more comfortable with as time has gone on. So there's a lot out there. I would start with low cost approaches and move from there.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned interview panels. What are your general thoughts on those in terms of the types of interviews and even the diversity of the interviewers on the panel?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of interview panels. I just feel like the more trained eyes, the better. Mm-hmm. Just not too many. So one of the challenges we've seen at Secret Solutions during the pandemic is because it's easy to interview people, more and more interviews get tagged on before someone gets hired. That is not the direction you want to go in. I'd rather see a smaller trained panel of interviewers, including some subject matter experts and others who are looking more for competency and culture fit, and being able to have those individuals be able to assess them and come together and make the best decision for the organization. Mm-hmm. Some people say a panel slows things down. I just don't think it has to. When it slows things down is when you try to break it up too much. So I would say interview and then get your consensus done quickly, so you don't have to track people down and try to schedule a number of meetings just to figure out who to hire. Now, I have a really great example I'd love to share from a former employer where I work. we trained a diverse pool of employees to serve as interview panelists for our company. So as we would move forward, we would have, of course, the people from the department, the subject matter experts, but we had people, and the pilot participants were from the company's diversity council. And they came in and really did a great job, one, of looking at the pool, ensuring that the pool was diverse. And what was interesting is, in addition to actually meeting and exceeding some of the metrics we set, it actually impacted employee engagement because we used it internally and externally. And many of the employees felt that they had a greater success, opportunity for success in the company because of the additional eyes that were included in the interview process. So eventually, people started raising their hands saying, can I be trained? I want to be in the interview pool too. It gave people a chance to meet individuals from other parts of the company, learn about other parts of the business. And it became something that was not just for diverse employees from the Diversity Council. It was an opportunity for everyone, but they became trained. They had an eye for what they were looking for. And people overall just had a greater confidence in career growth and their opportunities with staying with the company for a longer period of time. So it helped with retention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're giving opportunities to people that wouldn't normally do that kind of thing. So that makes complete sense. Okay, so I was listening to a podcast recently with Rich Davini, he's a former Navy SEAL, and he studied Navy SEAL candidates later on in his career to understand what differentiated those that were successful and those that weren't. Because they all had similar skill levels, but he found that the most successful candidates had inherent attributes that made them able to get through those grueling tests and exercises that they make them do. And as a result, he created assessments for organizations to be able to measure the attributes of their candidates, to be able to get a full picture of the individual. So an example of an attribute might be to be able to perform under pressure. So let's talk about assessments and the pros and cons. Many organizations use them in addition to interviews. What are your thoughts on them?
First of all, I'm certified in many assessments. So I've been trained to do all types of assessments, coaching, and actually selection. I really believe they can be valuable, but they have to be validated. So not every assessment is validated, and it can have a negative impact on certain groups of individuals. So that is the first absolute piece that I think any organization needs to look at. Once you're there, it can be really a great part of an overall assessment process as long as it's weighted appropriately. It's one piece of information. There have been times when we've agreed to include assessments as a part of the interview process. And after all the training and bias, I've had leaders come back to me and say, you know what, I just have a gut feeling and I want to hire this individual. I don't care what the interview said. I think they were nervous. That assessment, I don't know if I agree with it. And you have to be committed to saying, if we're going to have a process, we're going to be consistent with it. So we all have those biases, and there are times when we want to go with our gut, but that's why having panels, that's why including assessments and other pieces can be very important. The other thing I would say to you is I talk to candidates a lot about their preferred work environments. So two candidates with the exact same skills might not have the same success in an organization. So you might have one candidate who loves interacting with direct reports and work colleagues. So when people want to talk to that person, it doesn't matter what they're doing, they're going to drop it and speak to that person. They'll put their work aside and make that person feel like they're the most important thing that they're doing right now. The second candidate may make time, but prefers to work without interruption. While they both have equal technical skills, there are probably work environments where one would thrive better than the other. So we really work to make sure there's a cultural fit, and that cultural fit may not align with the overall culture of the company. So that may be something that you see in one department that you may not see as much in another. The need to have that heads down to move forward, or the need to really connect can change in a company. So making sure that people are set up for success when they enter is very, very important. I will say this too. There have been times in my career when I've chosen to take roles that moved against my natural grain. So I knew I needed to take a role in compensation. It was going to push me to do some things that I didn't love to do, but I learned so much. And I knew that it was for a short period of time. And the organization understood I was there to learn. And it was not a job that I was going to need to do long term. I needed to learn a certain amount of information so that I could be effective in that next role. When you go in and you know a job is developmental and you know it has a start and an end, you can work against the grain because you know that people are expecting you to learn, that you were not going to have to be an expert, but you're going to become competent, and that it really is a part of your growth. When you go into a role that is going to require you to work against your natural grain for a very long period of time, you're setting yourself up for a very difficult road, and really probably not going to be the most engaged person. And a lot of times it shows.
Yeah. And we're going to talk more a bit about setting people up for success, but once they've got the role. But let's just do a quick poll now, poll number 3, to find out a little bit more about the audience again. So if we can put poll number 3 up, it's, do you have any open leadership positions now? So if you could put in your responses. Okay, so we're pretty standard across the board right now. We've got a split. Just give it another 10 seconds. All right, so as of now, we've got 20%, yes, we do, 33%, no, we don't, but we will later this year. 43% we don't now and don't anticipate any this year, and 6% don't know.
It's interesting. This poll is very interesting to me, especially from leadership positions and what we anticipate, because I'm already starting to hear people who are maybe expecting to get a bonus, or are learning that they're not going to get a bonus. And a lot of transition starts to happen, at least when, for me and my clients, around the transition from first to second quarter. We start to see positions opening up. We start to see people moving. I don't know how the pandemic will impact that, yet I do. It will be interesting to see, even if you're not anticipating something, this is the critical time to think about, if you need to retain someone, that you let them know they're valuable. Right. You just, sometimes if people don't hear it, they don't know. So if you have some people in leadership, you know, for whatever reason, you just can't give them a bonus, think about what you can say to them to make sure they get retained. There's research out there that says that people, if you ask them 5 years later, they can't remember what their bonus amount was, but they can remember how it was communicated to them.
Right.
So I would say this is an important time to think about that.
And that segues really well into our next kind of topic, because we don't always think about recruitment as going beyond the hiring of a successful candidate. And there's an interesting quote from a senior recruiter at JP Morgan Chase, and who said, most people don't quit their jobs, they quit their managers. So how do you set up selected candidates to be successful in their new job?
So at Sacred Solutions, we do something very interesting for some of our roles, mostly, our higher level roles, leading people. I'll do first 90 days coaching. So I'll spend the first 90 to 120 days helping people become really successful in their roles. And it's different a lot of times than what will happen on the inside. So there's good intent many times in organizations, and we know how onboarding can be consistent or inconsistent, especially when we think about this thing called the break-even point. And that's the point from where you start to the point that you're actually contributing. So we believe by the coaching that we do, we help people to get to that break-even point even more quickly, but also help them to adjust themselves to the culture. Because once again, just like I learned when I went to Singapore, that culture is not going to adjust to you. You have to adjust to it first. So what do you need to do to be really successful? There's research out there that says an executive can take over a year to integrate an organization without solid onboarding and integration. So we look to make sure that that happens, I want to say in a quarter. We can start with someone and really help them to start landing successes within that first 90 to 120 days. And that helps the individual, and it also helps the organization.
Mm-hmm. So I believe the idea of coaching leaders as they start their new role is probably not as common as we think it is. And that's something that is unique to Sigrid Solutions. So let's test that a little. Let's do a poll relating to the ongoing success of employees. So can we have poll number 4 put up? Have you ever been assigned a buddy, mentor, or a coach after being hired? So we're seeing right now that a lot of people had a buddy or mentor. 2/3, a third. So 66% right now had a buddy or a mentor. I would say 50. Now it's 50%. 50%. Oh, it's even. Oh, I'm going to wait. I'm going to hold on because it's changing. Let me give it 10 seconds. So this is quite interesting because only 29% right now have had a buddy or mentor, which is quite low, because I thought that was kind of a common process in an organization. 11% had a coach, and that's I feel like that's to be expected in terms of what I've seen. But 58% did not receive formal support once hired, which is tough.
I would say it's even in a pandemic.
Yes.
So if you're doing an organization and everyone is not on site, there are certain things that even if they get missed in the intent of the onboarding, by just being in an office where you're seeing other people,
right,
some of those things can get forgiven. When you are trying to start with an organization and you don't have that type of support, it's very, very, very difficult to integrate and misinterpret intent. So my boss is trying to support me. I feel like my boss is micromanaging me. Mm-hmm. I'm in a meeting, I give feedback, there's quiet, I don't know what to think. Are they, thinking I don't add value? You just don't have the same types of support. So being able to structure that and make sure that someone has a mentor, and the mentor is very clear on the expectations, and they have a buddy, and the buddy is very clear on the expectations, and coaching, all of those things become very, very important. If you can't afford a coach one-on-one, some organizations do small group coaching. We're going to bring all the people together and do it. And honestly, some companies have had to do what I call reboarding. We hired some people in 2000. Sorry, we didn't do a good job of onboarding, so we need to reboard you now. So let's make up. And we're saying we had a misstep. Yep. We're going to do it right now. Let's pull you together. We have 10 people. We're going to do onboarding for all of you in a group. And you're also going to become a cohort of supporters and peers.
Yeah, exactly. Being honest, I think, about missteps is something that doesn't happen in all organizations. So I think that's a really good point. All right, we're going to go to Q&A soon, but before we do, we've got one final poll question to wrap up. Having heard the ways in which organizations can enhance their talent acquisition strategy from Christy, we've got poll number 5. So is it likely that your organization or an organization that you're aware of will need help from a professional recruiting firm to hire diverse candidates in leadership roles? Just give everybody 20 seconds to respond. A lot of maybes right now. Okay, so we've got 50-50 right now. 50% yes, definitely, or 42%. I'm going to wait again. Keep jumping again. All right, so 20% said yes, definitely. There's a lot that 73% said maybe, and no for 6%. Okay, so this is the end of the areas that we wanted to cover. If we can move to the next slide, please. Before we go to Q&A, I'd just like to share some useful resources that you may want to take advantage of. So in addition to our webinar series, which you'll see on our events page, we're very active in other ways that you can benefit from. Our office has been featured in DEI reports that you can access by key players like Deloitte and Mercer, and you can also see some of the other activities here like blogs, roundtables, ebooks, and more. Okay, so let's move to the next slide, which is the Q&A, and let's see if anybody has questions. We've got a few here. So I think initially somebody has said, as someone in the HR realm, it's great that you push through the adversity of being the only at times. How do you feel we can empower those not within an HR scope to do the same? I can relate to how difficult it can be to stay in a company where you don't see someone like yourself, but then it's difficult to retain that diversity that the company is striving to build up.
So I think what's interesting about the times when I was lonely is many of my friends were in the same type of situation. So even as I was the only maybe inside of an organization, I had peers who would talk to me about their situations. So I knew what I was experiencing was now unique. I also, even as being the only, I felt like I had champions within the organization. So I felt like there were people who wanted me to be successful and gave me opportunities, would say, oh, we're going to have a conference. I want you to come and speak. I know you don't have any money in your budget, so sales is going to pay for you to fly to New Orleans. Okay. So I had those were the pieces, I would call them glue, that kept me going in the organization. I also felt trusted. And when I would push, I didn't feel second guessed. So if I introduced something and it was mildly successful, I didn't feel that people looked at me as not being credible because it was not over the top successful. And sometimes I think when people are the only, they overthink. I know I have done it in the past, certain experiences, and will, without that support and those champions, will feel less and less connected to the organization, to the point that if someone calls them, they'll entertain the question of, are you open to looking? Mm-hmm. So I would say, even as you look outside the organization, you can also look inside and think of people who you have things in common with. So yes, I was the only African-American woman, perhaps, but there were lots of people who had different experiences that I had in common, who I connected with and I felt supported with. But I had to work to make those relationships they didn't just develop by osmosis. I really did have to work to make sure that I developed and maintained those. I'm still in contact with many of the people who were my champions and my friends at work, even though I'm not with the companies anymore.
Great, thanks, Christy. We have a question from Amelia. What might be our strategy for creating an interview panel if we aren't yet diverse? So she's saying her interview panel will be very white at this point.
So I think there's a few opportunities that you might have, depending on how comfortable you might be with it. So are there partners that you have? Are there other organizations that you work with that deliver services to you that might have more diversity? Might there be community organization that you support that would be willing to come in and help you? I think that can definitely be something that can help make your panels more diverse as you look forward. I would say the other thing is just making sure that training takes place, and knowing that part of your journey is to make sure as you bring more diverse people into the organization that you're creating an environment where they feel championed and supported, and they have the opportunity to make mistakes and grow and have that stickiness that allows them to want to remain.
Thanks, Christy. And then I think we've just got one more question here from Wendy. Christy, since you raised the issue of collecting data, so you have a baseline on diversity, we found an issue when millennials don't wish to self-report. Have you run across this type of issue? Aside from communicating the why of collecting the data, how do you deal with this so that you can move your organization forward? It's a great question.
I've seen this quite a bit. And sometimes there are many reasons why people don't want to self-report, and sometimes there's issues of trust. One of the things that we do for organizations, we do an engagement survey, but we will also do small group one-on-one or small group focus groups. And I will say anytime you collect information, you have the raw data, but you don't always have the story behind it. So being able to do those focus groups, sometimes you may want to hire somebody from the outside just to come in to do that work for you, so people feel safe, and to ask. And you can gather a lot of really great information and also explain to people why we're collecting the information that we need. So being able to cut in a certain way to be able to understand. So if you're not able to do that short term, the focus groups can help you to get a little more narrative. You can ask people to volunteer to participate, and you may have to use that for a bit until people feel a little more comfortable.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Dexter, about giving the reason why you want that data, because a lot of people, they don't understand that diversity is a priority for companies, and they want to track and they want metrics, and they may not be willing to give that information. But if they knew that, then it may be a different story.
And as we do our engagement surveys, we find that there is more trust and transparency and actually just compliance and completing the surveys when a third party does it. So sometimes for a cost, there are lots of platforms out there you can do your own surveys. But if you're looking for people to feel comfortable that somehow their information won't be tracked, they can be really honest, it may be worth the investment of having an outside company come in to do that for you. The other thing that you have an opportunity to do, let's say you don't get great information on the baseline for diversity, but you select a couple areas you're going to focus on, then you can do pulse surveys. And in those pulse surveys, you can gather information to be able to move forward. Sometimes it's a little more tricky. I've done this at certain companies. We have shared information to a third party and they use unique identifiers for people to fill out the survey. So people didn't have to answer demographic information because we provided it to the third party, and people were able to go in with their unique identifier, answer the survey questions, and we received a report that had that information, but it was held fully by the third party. That costs a little more money. And depending on your budget, you may or may not want to take that approach, but you have some different things depending on where you sit as a company and how you can approach that.
Great. Thank you, Christy. We've got one more question here. Is professional search only for large companies, or can smaller organizations take advantage of professional search?
That's a great question. I would say we have very large companies that we work with, but a lot of the companies that we work with are smaller, and they are at that point where they're actually startups, or they have moved beyond startup to really experiencing accelerated growth, yet they have not built everything that they need to do to be successful. So they might have a great HR department, but really no one who has expertise in the recruiting, and they want diversity. And those individuals are really focused more on compliance and other pieces that are very important to keep the company running and building as they grow. So policies, procedures, those kinds of things. So what we do is go into organizations and we provide them with a very specific set of skills that they don't have to hold inside, and they know that we are their trusted advisors as we do that. The other thing that has happened a lot of times as we recruit is we learn that there might be small things that could help them be even more successful. So we will help, for example, with org design. We've done one job description and we're like, okay, that job is a little bigger than perhaps one person should be doing. So let's talk a little bit about how you're structured. How can we adjust this? Are there different ways to get this work done so that we can find you a candidate in the salary range that you're looking for? Because what you're asking us to find is probably going to be really difficult. So we can become that trusted advisor in some of those areas that wrap around, really to make sure that that success is there long term.
Great. I think we have time for one final question. Quick question, quick answer. Christy, you talked about culture fit. How about culture add?
So the interesting thing about fit is I call it a snapshot in time. So anytime you ask me to describe a culture, that is at that moment right then. And I talked a lot with leadership teams about how every team changes when a person leaves and when a person joins. So anytime you add someone to an organization, it's going to shift the culture. It absolutely will. It shifts that experience that people have every single day. So being able to set people up for success, to be able to come in, to feel that they can express themselves fully and totally contribute, and giving them the support to understand. I'm working with a client right now for First 90 Days. She formerly worked at an automotive organization, very structured, and she's now in a sales and marketing company. And the things that she in her mind has expectations for, sometimes she'll ask a question and they'll laugh. They're like, we'll have a policy for that next week, but not right now. It doesn't exist. So helping her to understand what made her successful in the company before. And also know, and I tell people this all the time, when you start with a company, you have about 3 months to ask anything. So take advantage of it. Be as curious as possible, because there's no dumb answers. I mean, no dumb questions in that time period. No one is going to look at you and say, why did she ask that? You don't know. Mm-hmm. But you want to be as curious as possible and get every question in there so that you can set yourself up for success. So you're not asking them 9 months, a year in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Well, I think we've covered all the questions in the chat. So if anyone has any other questions later on that they think of about this webinar or our webinars in general, you can always write to us at webinar@ouroffice.io. Christy, thank you so much for joining us and sharing so many great insights.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for attending as well. And we hope to see you at our next webinar, which is on March 18th, on why employee assistance programs are more important than ever. So thank you again, and we'll now close out the webinar.